Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming in on a soaking Sydney night. I'm glad you all made it safely. Welcome to the war on whistleblowers and their publishers, Manning, Snowden and Assange. To discuss these issues tonight, we've got, well, as you already know, a pretty remarkable group of people, all of whom are on the front line of this war. Alexa O'Brien is an activist, a journalist, a filmmaker who has, in the last 3 years alone, covered the WikiLeaks cables, Guantanamo Bay files, the Arab Spring, the Occupy movement in the United States, and, of course, who, for much of the pre-trial and trial of Chelsea Manning, provided the only transcripts and analysis of proceedings, for which work she was shortlisted for the 2013 Martha Gellhorn Prize for Journalism. Robert Mann is Emeritus Professor at La Trobe University, author or editor of some 20 books, and innumerable chapters and articles on Australian politics, political culture, Indigenous issues, climate science, the media, and much else besides. Joining us tonight by Skype is Glenn Greenwald, a columnist on civil liberties and US national security issues for The Guardian, and a former constitutional lawyer until 2012. He was a contributing writer at Salon.com, which is where many of us, I think, first encountered his remarkable work on national security issues. He's the, the author of How Would a Patriot Act? On the Bush administration's use of executive power, A Tragic Legacy, which is on the legacy of George W. Bush, and how could you name a book on the George W. Bush legacy any other way? And With Liberty and Justice for Some, How the Law is Used to Destroy Equality and Protect the Powerful. Most recently, of course, as you all know, he, along with journalists like Laura Poitras, was responsible for the publication of the continuing series of remarkable revelations about internet and telecommunications surveillance from Edward Snowden. David Coombs is a soldier, lawyer, and US Army court-martial defence attorney. He has over 12 years of active duty service and has practiced, prosecuted, written on, and taught criminal law for over 15 years. Since leaving active duty service with the Judge Advocate General's Corps in 2009, he's run a private practice as a defence attorney, and in that capacity, he defended Chelsea Manning in her trial. And Julian Assange, well, he needs no introduction to Australians, if only for his John Farnham impersonation. He is editor-in-chief and publisher of WikiLeaks, and despite what Bob Carr might claim, is the subject of a continuing investigation by a US grand jury under the US Espionage Act. In August 2012, he was granted asylum by Ecuador on the basis that he faced political persecution. He joins us tonight from the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where he has been, to use one of my favourite media cliches, quote unquote, holed up since June 2012, when he sought refuge there. Now, please bear in mind that, as you can see, 3 of our guests are joining us by Skype. If they do drop out, please be patient. We've got Fort Meade on speed dial, and we'll try and ask the National Security Agency to get their feedback as soon as possible. Okay, we've got an outstanding group of individuals here and lots to discuss, so let's get going. We'll talk a lot tonight about whistleblowing, the politics around whistleblowing, and the reaction of governments to whistleblowing. We'll want to start with the whistleblowers themselves. What we've learnt from them, what motivated them, and what the impact on them has been of their decisions. And I want to go first to Glenn Greenwald and ask him, first of all, and this is an interesting question given just how extensive the revelations from Edward Snowden have been, but I want to ask Glenn, what are the key lessons that you think we've got from what Edward Snowden has given us and what we are continuing to learn from his revelations, and what motivated him to take such a life-changing decision as he took to reveal what he'd learnt about the US government surveillance systems? Glenn.
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me and thanks for putting together such a great event with a fantastic panel. I'm as interested in listening to everybody as I am in speaking. So I really look forward to the next 90 minutes or so. I spent a long time, I was speaking with Mr. Snowden before I got to Hong Kong, and a huge amount of time once I got there, asking him about exactly what you just asked me, namely what motivated him as a 29-year-old with a life that most people find generally very fulfilling. He had a longtime girlfriend. He had a very stable career. He was living in Hawaii. He had a lucrative paycheck, all kinds of opportunity ahead of him. What would motivate somebody like that literally to throw that all away, to unravel their entire existence, to risk what we all assumed was the most likely outcome, which was ending up in U.S. custody and then being imprisoned under the Espionage Act for the next several decades, if not for the rest of his life, if not something worse? What would motivate or cause somebody to really make that personal choice? The reason I spent so much time asking that and exploring that with him was severalfold. In part, I was just incredibly curious. But also, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't working with somebody and helping them unravel their life unless it was really a fully informed choice that they had made, that this was something that they had really thought through, and as an adult with autonomy had made the choice that this is the course that they wanted to pursue. And the only reason why I ended up working with him as extensively as I did is because he provided me with very convincing rationale about what his motive was. And he essentially told me, and it's something that we've heard from whistleblowers for a long time, including those in the United States, whether it be Chelsea Manning or Daniel Ellsberg or a whole slew of others who have been prosecuted by the Obama administration, that once you discover wrongdoing and dangers taking place within this system and reach a conclusion that the system itself provides no real mechanism for addressing those dangers and those injustices within the rules that they've created. That's the contrary. These rules that have been created are designed to conceal and protect those injustices. That you really only have two choices as a human being. Number one is you can remain silent about those injustices and continue to conceal and enable them to help the world, to help the people who are perpetrating those injustices continue to do so. Or number two, you can make a conscious choice to sacrifice your own self-interest, essentially to violate those rules in order to help bring about transparency, to let people around the world know what is being done to them and to allow a debate about whether it should be stopped and how. And what he told me was that just personally, he would not have been able to live with himself, to have it sit on his conscience, to be able to know that there was this massive spying agency being built in the dark that was destroying internet freedom, eroding privacy for everybody around the world, and spend the rest of his life knowing that he did nothing to stop it, that in fact he would continue to work within it and help perpetuate it. And so in one sense, it was a very selfless act because he sacrificed his own self-interest for the good of everybody else. But in another sense, it was a self-interested act in that he just felt that as a person of conscience, he would be incapable of living the rest of his life comfortably or in good faith or with a clean conscience had he allowed all of this to continue. And as far as what we've learned from him, I think the number one lesson of what we've learned substantively is that the NSA and its four allies in the world, its four closest allies, Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, and New Zealand, really are building a system that has as its goal the complete elimination of privacy around the world. But I think what we've learned, probably in a more far-reaching way, is that there is no limit on what a single individual can achieve if they really make a choice following their conscience and their passion. I mean, he's somebody who had very little prestige or power or position, and yet he has literally changed the world. He has undermined the most powerful institutions, shined light on what it was that they were doing, radically altered how we think about a whole variety of critical issues. And I think that courage that he displayed, but especially the proof that he provided that even a single individual can stand against the most powerful institutions and change them and challenge them is something that will probably endure more than the specific revelations themselves.
David Coombs, what motivated Chelsea Manning to take the decision that she did to reveal the range of materials that she provided to WikiLeaks? And again, obviously a life-changing decision, and even more so than Edward Snowden.
Yes, the IM chats with Adrienne Lameau helped really kind of shed light on that. But throughout the trial, we brought up her motivation. And really her motivation was after she saw and read what she was seeing on a daily basis, she realized that this is stuff that the American public should know, stuff that the world should know. And she talked about in the Adrian Lameau chat, the fact that she couldn't let this just stay inside of her head when she knew that this information was something that the American public and in fact the world should see. So much like Edward Snowden, I think there came a time where she was seeing stuff and believing that this shouldn't really be classified. And if it was something that should be classified, it's something that the American public still needed to know that their government was doing. So for her, it was more of an issue of this is something that I have to get out. This is something that I cannot keep inside. And when she made her decision, a very brave one, she knew the risks at the time. And since that event has happened, obviously she's paid a very heavy price. But for herself, the fact that she paid that price and is willing to continue to pay the price shows really how important this is, not only for American public, but really for everyone in the world to know that the governments are doing things in our name, and oftentimes they're doing that without us knowing what the actual conduct that they're doing. And when we're making decisions on what should be done, we need to have all the information. So Chelsea, I think she made this decision. It was a life-changing decision, and it'll be something that will be with her for the rest of her life.
Julian Assange, you've been dealing with the material that Chelsea Manning, or Bradley Manning, as he was then, provided for a number of years now. You've seen how it's played out. It might be helpful to actually just, in a way, recap what the key lessons are that we've learnt from the remarkable array of material that Chelsea Manning ended up providing. What for you are the kind of other core revelations that Chelsea Manning's provided to the world?
Thanks. Well, I'll get to that, but first of all, for the last 3 years, I've become an expert about not talking about Chelsea Manning or putting any words into her mouth. And I do understand that she has made certain statements in the trial process, and I understand the importance of those, but I don't think they were made with her own free will. I think she was coerced into them as part of the judicial process. So I'm not going to be contributing or reinforcing statements that were made by someone's lack of free will. There was not an intent, at least 3 years ago, to make those statements. They've come about as a result of invidious position where that young soldier was up for their entire life in prison. Okay, so what did those publications that you mentioned do? Well, first of all, people always want key examples. And what is most present to me, it's not about key examples. It's not about a particular thing. It's about 100,000 different things. It's about something that lets us change our perception on many, many different places and in many different ways, and the system itself. You will often hear people speak about what was the key event that needed the whistle to be blown on, and couldn't this have been taken through internal channels? Well, in Manning's case, as well as a number of others, there were key events that tried to be taken through internal channels. But how do you blow the whistle on the system itself? How do you blow the whistle on the system itself when you see so many events revealing the same problem again and again, which is a cavalier approach to human life, a cavalier approach to the suffering of people? There has to be a mechanism where people can blow a whistle on the system itself, and obviously that cannot be within the system. Now, if we want to look at some key examples, the Afghan war diaries, which revealed 90,000 different significant acts in Afghanistan down to the metre where they occurred, the particular locations involved, the deaths of about 20,000 different people, individually recorded. That changed the perception of the Afghan war in 2010 irrevocably. We went from a situation where there was a discussion in early 2010 on whether more troops were needed and was the United States winning the war in Afghanistan or not. Post the revelations of the Afghan war logs, the discussion was no longer that. The discussion was, how can we get out? That it is a debacle, a quagmire, and how can we get out? And the discussion since that point has always been, how can we get out? A very important shift in perception of that war. Cablegate, a particular cable in there, ended the Iraq War. Cablegate ended the Iraq War. How did that happen? The United States forces were renegotiating their continued presence in Iraq. The Iraqi government was beset with publicity from one of those cables that demonstrated that an Iraqi family had been killed in a house in 2006. An airstrike had been called in to blow up and conceal the evidence. Came out as a result of or received wide attention as a result of our publication, which entered into the Iraqi domestic political climate, where the United States forces were trying to negotiate immunity, continued immunity for their presence in Iraq. The Maliki government said, no, if US forces stay beyond 2011, there will be no more immunity. And Prime Minister Maliki specifically cited that document as a reason why immunity could not be extended, because we could not have further incidences like that. So Cablegate was critical in ending the Iraq War. Of course, perhaps it would have ended sometime later, who knows? But that year, Cablegate ended it. Cablegate, as many people have said...
Sorry, Julian, I want to move on because we've only got 90 minutes.
Yeah.
So, Alexa, Chelsea, or Bradley, as she was then, was arrested in May 2010, I think May 2010. Her trial is only recently completed. Why did it take so long, and what happened to Chelsea during the 3 years that she spent in prison?
Well, are you asking me what happened to Chelsea personally, or?
Well, in terms of what we know about the treatment that Chelsea experienced.
Well, I would say that I'll talk to you about the trial and how it was conducted, because I've never spoken to Chelsea Manning, so I can't speak for her. One of the most important aspects of this trial, one of the most important questions, was whether or not Chelsea Manning received a fair trial. It's my opinion, based on my experience of being at Fort Meade and having covered the proceedings, that Chelsea Manning did not receive a fair trial. While the Congress in the US continues to pass legislation allowing for the indefinite detention of any person anywhere across the globe, no charges, no trial, what's called the National Defense Authorization Act for year 2012. Chelsea Manning was charged with aiding the enemy, which is one of two articles under the Uniform Code of Military Justice that applies to any person. So it's not just military personnel. That enough should have been a reason for Colonel Denise Lynn, the presiding military judge, to provide the press pool with copies of her rulings. We never got a copy of her speedy trial ruling. Manning was held longer than any accused awaiting court-martial in the history of US military law, yet the presiding military judge rules that her speedy trial rights have not been violated. Manning spends 9 months at Quantico. The court rules that a portion of that was considered to be unlawful. The UN Special Rapporteur on Torture said that Manning experienced cruel and inhumane treatment while at Quantico. The UN Special Rapporteur was not allowed to testify at her court-martial because the UN Special Rapporteur doesn't have any power over an American court. That was what the judge ruled. The presiding military judge granted Manning 112 days of sentencing credit on a 35-year sentence. The reason why it was important is this case had wide ramifications and does and continues and will have a set of precedent with regards to the First Amendment. Manning was accused, charged, and convicted. He was charged with aiding the enemy and espionage for disclosures to the press, and convicted of espionage, the first whistleblower to be convicted of espionage. The public was denied not only access to those rulings, but over 45,000 pages of court filings until 18 months into this legal proceeding. It was covered by three or four independent or alternative journalists. It was the unfounded allegations of a government informant that Manning leaked top secret material that was part of the wave of misinformation that continues to this day. I was speaking to actually a great journalist a couple of days ago, and they were still under the impression that Manning had pled to 10 offenses, not 10 lesser included offenses.
Just tease out for a bit, because I think a lot of people do think that Bradley Manning leaked top secret material, and indeed only top secret material, but that's not the case.
No, this was unclassified or lower level classified material, much of it based on public reporting. So for example, if you look at the Guantanamo files, the names or pieces of content within the detainee assessment briefs were sourced from lawfully released FOIA requests or habeas cases.
David, I suspect a lot of Australians don't fully appreciate that this wasn't a standard criminal trial that Chelsea Manning went through. This was a court-martial, and there are a number of interesting legal dimensions to it. Can you talk about a couple of those? That's the definition of a sarcastic smile, I think, right there. Can you talk about a couple of the sort of the more interesting legal dimensions to the trial, and what are the sort of grounds that will be used for an appeal, without tipping your hand too much, I guess?
Well, first of all, I won't be doing the appeal. Really, the main reason for that is you want to have an attorney who can look at everything that I did during the trial and second guess that. So if I were the one handling the appeal, it would be unlikely that I would second guess anything I did, because I believed what I was doing and still do believe what I did during the trial was in the best interest of my client. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of the trial for me, and there were several issues that I think on appeal will certainly get reviewed: the speedy trial, the unlawful pretrial punishment, the charging decisions, the fact that they really brought an unprecedented offense of aiding the enemy for giving information to a journalist, the made-up offense of wanton publication. All those will undoubtedly get reviewed, but this case really put a light on the unfairness of a classified evidence case. In a typical trial, I will get all the discovery. I'll have the ability to see everything that was collected by the government, question witnesses who were interviewed. Some witnesses, obviously, the government doesn't do a very good job in most cases in a criminal investigation. So usually I find witnesses that they don't, that coincidentally help my case. But in a classified evidence case, I don't get much of that. In fact, I have to ask in discovery to obtain documentation from the government that I really have to guess at that they have. And that's because they don't have an open file system in a classified evidence case. Even though I had a security clearance, even though I clearly had a need to know when it came to my client and what he was charged with or she was charged with. And in this instance, what I had to do was submit discovery requests. The government would look at those discovery requests and then tell me that either, yes, we have this information, but it's not relevant to your case, or we don't have this information. And I had to trust the government and a prosecutor at that, who really was interested in getting a conviction and a harsh sentence, would look at the evidence in such a way that a defense counsel might look at it and say, yes, I can make a point from this. So really the classified aspect of this trial, in my estimation, made it a very unfair and unlevel playing ground. I believe that hopefully will be something that on appeal we get access to information, or we find something that should have been given to us at the trial level, and that may make a difference. And again, the other issues, the speedy trial, the unlawful pretrial punishment, some of the charging decisions, all of that, really in this case, the government took almost an unprecedented stance in a kind of win at all costs position, where they would push the envelope on every legal issue. So for an appellate counsel, this will hopefully be a case in which he or she finds a lot of avenues for relief for Chelsea.
Thanks, David. Do we have Glenn? Have we dialed Fort Meade to get Glenn back? No, not yet. Okay, I want to turn to Robert Mann now and broaden, or step back a little bit. Robert, whistleblowers aren't a contemporary phenomenon. Whistleblowing sites indeed have been around for a long time, going right back to almost the start of the public internet. But what's changed about whistleblowing in recent years? I mean, especially courtesy of Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden, whistleblowing is on the global agenda and has global impacts. What's changed? Is it the dominance of national security, or is it something else?
Well, I feel slightly embarrassed in saying this in the presence of Julian Assange, because I'm going to praise him. It seems to me that very few new ideas enter politics, but I think WikiLeaks and Julian Assange had a new idea. And it's an idea linked to the fact that we live in an electronic age, and there will be agencies of government in which there are employees that have access to vast amounts of information and that can communicate them via the internet, and that they have a moral conscience. So they suddenly are apprised of the fact that something evil is happening in the world and they want to do good in regard to it. Now, I think what Julian Assange did through WikiLeaks is one of the really important interventions in contemporary times, which is to see how a system of a person stricken by conscience in an internet age with access to vast amounts of information that they think shows wicked and evil action can make it politically effective. And so I think that what's happened with Chelsea Manning and what's happened with Edward Snowden has happened is that an idea entered the world that you could try and improve the world by acts of extraordinary courage. But you had to be sitting with data in an electronic age and with the sense that something could happen with it politically. I happen to think that since 9/11, what I call the elites in the West have betrayed humankind, and I think partly of the wars, particularly in Iraq, a war without justification or legality. I think of the global financial crisis, in which an astonishing accumulation of wealth to the top 1%, particularly in the United States, took place. And I think particularly of climate change, where the elites in the West have refused to do the obvious, which is to not use fossil fuels as a source of energy. So we live in an age in which we're very open to the need for transformation, and I feel incredibly honoured to be tonight with three of the people that have done so much. Alexa at the trial, and if Glenn was still with us, Glenn, who's been the great journalist in the Edward Snowden case, and Julian, who I think had this transformational idea.
Julian, as luck would have it, my next question was to you. I mean, digitisation and the internet, I guess, has facilitated whistleblowers. Has it also hampered whistleblowers in the sense that there are now more risks for them. Those are the sort of risks that WikiLeaks tried to address through an anonymisation system, but the sort of risks that we now see courtesy of the NSA surveillance and the fact that the Obama administration is so able to go after whistleblowers and journalists.
Well, you might recall, sorry, there's a bit of echo here. You might recall a fuss about grand jury subpoenas being issued for the Associated Press a few months ago in the United States, just before the Edward Snowden revelations started coming out. And our response then was, well, this is completely absurd. I mean, why are you making a fuss about this? The telephone records of some limited number of AP journalists have been obtained by the US government when it has the telephone records of every single journalist and every single source being obtained by the National Security Agency. And that subsequently came out publicly thanks to Edward Snowden and Glenn's work, that all telecommunications records involving the telephone system are being seized. So, yes, that's right. For conventional journalism, the game is over as far as reportage on the national security state or its friends. Perhaps that's the wrong word to use, friends, but or it's the various contractors that are involved. The National Security Agency, 80% of its budget goes to contractors like Booz Allen Hamilton and Northrop and Raytheon and so on. So I think it's quite a difficult age for journalists and their sources. In Australia, telephone records have been pulled for alleged sources dealing with the Australian newspaper. That's known, and I presume that's also true in a number of other cases. So the digital footprint that everyone is leaving is becoming larger and larger. The smartphones are just another tracking device that can also make calls. That data essentially collected. So to deal with that digital invasion of privacy, which we're all entering into, you have to have specialist organisations to fight back against it. And yeah, that's what we've done. It makes it, to some extent, it's good for us in that the competition is being mowed down all over the world and simply can't protect their sources in any way at all. We have a hope of doing it, but yeah, it's getting harder.
This is a question I'd love to direct to Glenn, but I'll direct it back to you, Julian. I mean, if I was a whistleblower at the moment and my decision was whether to go to a mainstream media journalist or not, and it was in relation to high-level national security matters, would you recommend that such a person go to a mainstream media journalist, or is there simply no guarantee of any sort of anonymity or security in that regard?
Well, I mean, first of all, you have to think about whether the journalist will sell you out. I mean, that's the biggest problem, right? That actually most journalists can't be trusted when you're dealing with material at that level. Most institutions can't be trusted, which is why Edward Snowden had quite a wise choice in picking key journalists. Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras had a very well-defined position in working with us or dealing with us over a number of issues or reporting on what we've been doing. Both, although I suspect he didn't consider that, based outside the United States, Glenn in Brazil and Laura Poitras in Germany, although both are originally from New York. The telecommunications path is, of course, another issue to consider. Well, yes, if you can just bump into Glenn Greenwald in the street, you might be all right. Or Philip Dorling, a great Australian journalist who I'm sure at a human level would protect people. But how do you actually establish the contact? That's not so easy for anyone who is not technical.
Alexa, I wanted to we're going to get Glenn back very shortly. I wanted to ask you about the issue of legitimate mechanisms. This is one of the arguments put against all whistleblowers, but has been elevated particularly in relation to both Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden, that there were legitimate mechanisms by which they could raise these very serious issues, and that they never needed to go to the press, they never needed to broach them publicly. How credible is that argument, particularly in the context of the United States?
Well, I think that it's credible in the sense that if you're going to be prosecuted by the U.S. government, it's better that you have shown a track record that you've at least tried. I mean, one of the difficulties of watching the Manning trial is that in many respects, Manning was wide open to a lot of misinformation and, you know, and Manning had said actually, you know, towards the end of the trial that I think this is something I would actually want to ask Coombs. I mean, clearly, I don't think that it's legitimate in the sense that I think that Manning probably would have still felt the need to leak based on what she said in her statements in court. And I think that within the military system, there was such a complete breakdown in her chain of command. When there were other issues that Manning had gone to her chain of command about, they were completely negligent. I think also there was also a breakdown already in a lot. If we look at even just like collateral murder, for example, the fact that Reuters couldn't even get, you know,
Couldn't get a copy of the video
right.
Despite FOI.
However, I think if you're being prosecuted by the U.S. government, if you show a strong track record, like look at Thomas Drake, for example. Even he who had gone and showed that he had tried to speak to individuals, the Inspector General and the like, he was still prosecuted with espionage. I think it gives you a little bit of leg room in the courtroom.
David, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I will say that one thing Chelsea understood was she knew the system. And she understood that if you went through the so-called legitimate channels, that information is still going to remain within the government, and it's not going to be released to the public. So even if you follow that channel, or what would be called legitimate channels, the issue that you're trying to address of why is this information secret, why isn't this information out in the public so that the public can see it, is not going to be addressed. And I think for Chelsea, she realized quite early on, once she started to see this stuff, that there was really no reason for it to be secret. And that if the American public saw it, or the public of the world saw it, that you would hopefully have reforms. You would have debates about what we're doing in Iraq, what we're doing in Afghanistan. And really to kind of go back just for a moment to something that you addressed earlier with Julian, Chelsea chose to release the information to WikiLeaks, and you can look to one of the documents she was charged with, the 2008 Army Counterintelligence Report. And you can see that the focus there was in identifying somebody who provided information to WikiLeaks and then prosecuting them to the fullest extent of the law in order to send a message to all would-be whistleblowers that it's an unsafe endeavor to give information to WikiLeaks, really in an effort to destroy that organization. And I'm hoping that 2008 report is proven to be wrong. And that's because we need organizations like WikiLeaks. We need legitimate news organizations that are not subjected to corporations, that are not subjected to sponsors and the government, in order to release information that other news organizations might sit on. So in this instance, if Chelsea did go, and she did initially try to go through what would be considered mainstream media, and when she contacted, say, for example, the Washington Post, which she did, she was really ignored. They didn't believe the information that she had in her, I guess, possession was legitimate. It took an organization like WikiLeaks, somebody who would accept information, verify what it is, crowdsource it in order to get it out, in order for people to talk about it. It took that type of organization to get this information out to the world. And when you look at it now, when you see everything that has been released, you have to ask yourself, why was this information classified to begin with? Why wasn't this part of the debate on what we were doing in Iraq, what we're doing and are doing currently in Afghanistan? And, to show again that the so-called legitimate avenues do not work, as Alexa pointed out, you had Reuters trying to get access to the collateral murder video. And they were told in the response that essentially that video did not exist. And clearly the reason why that was the case was because of what that video showed. Content that even the most, biased person for pro-government would look at this and say, you know what, there's something wrong with this picture. This information shows wrongdoing, and it should be public. So for that, I think Chelsea ultimately, as fate would have it, chose the best organization to release this information to, a legitimate news organization that would not be subjected to influence from either government or corporate sponsors.
Glenn, can you hear us? No.
Yes, I can.
Oh, welcome back, Glenn. We've been making do without you. None too successfully. Look, one of the other lines that is the most persistent line, in fact, that's pushed against whistleblowers, national security whistleblowers, is that these leaks inflict enormous damage on. They undermine national security. In the case of Chelsea Manning, it was that they placed individuals in harm's way. In the case of Edward Snowden, it's assisting terrorists. What's the basic response to that? I mean, this is all about the balance between national security and privacy, and yet it seems to be a balance that always comes down on the side of national security as far as governments and a lot of the media are concerned.
I think people have realized rather widely now that the idea that whistleblowers are endangering national security is really just a tactic and an excuse that people in power reflexively invoke in order to legitimize a form of transparency. What they really mean, of course, is that what's being damaged is their own reputation and credibility and their ability to abuse their power in the dark. But let me just take a step back in addressing that question and speak generally about the tactics that are used against whistleblowers. Because I think it's unquestionably true that WikiLeaks and Julian have brought incredibly important innovations and probably inspired a whole generation of whistleblowers who might not have thought about bringing transparency before. I know when I spoke with Snowden, he was certainly inspired by what WikiLeaks did, what Julian did, what Chelsea Manning did. But he was also inspired by a whistleblower from 40 years ago named Daniel Ellsberg, who, of course, was really the person who in modern U.S. history pioneered the idea of mass leaking. He leaked to the New York Times many thousands of pages of top secret documents and was accused then as well of endangering national security, putting lives at risk, even though most people now regard Daniel Ellsberg as a hero and understand that those attacks on him were the ones that were illegitimate. And I think that this is really a crucial thing to think about in any discussion of whistleblowing and leakers, is just how much of a threat it poses to prevailing orthodoxies and the prevailing order, which is why you see the identical treatment being meted out to anybody who really dissents from institutional authority. And typically that attack is not so much, well, this person is harming national security. It's really an effort to demonize the personality, to suggest that there must be some kind of strangeness or weirdness or even insanity that must be motivating somebody to dissent so severely from our predominant institutions. And of course, if you look at what was done to Daniel Ellsberg, they broke into the office of his psychoanalyst, something I for a long time never understood. Why, even if they discovered really incriminating things about his psychosexual state, would that help them discredit the Pentagon Papers? And I remember once I asked him about that, and he said, if they can prove that what I did was the byproduct of insanity or weirdness or craziness, it will not only make people not want to be associated with me, but will also make them run away from everything that I've done, including the revelations. And you saw the New York Times do that incessantly to Julian. And on the day that they published the Iraq war logs, publishing incredibly profound evidence of war crimes, they gave equal prominence to an article about Julian's alleged personality flaws by their pro-war reporter, John Burns. They even included a quote saying he's not in his right mind. Several months later, the paper's executive editor, Bill Keller, wrote about Julian's alleged personal sanitation habits and shared with the world the critically important news that his socks were dirty. They did the same thing with Chelsea Manning, even though she provided evidence of her in her own words about what motivated her. They tried to suggest that it was really due to her struggles with gender disorder, personality flaws, and the like. And now you see them do that with Edward Snowden as well, the idea that he's just a fame-seeking narcissist. And I think the reason that this happens, these kind of attacks take place on whistleblowers, is critically important. It's often obscured. And there's actually an article today in the New York Times by a philosophy professor at Northwestern, Peter Ludlow, that talks about this point, which is we always talk about the moral acts of the people who dissent from these institutions and who blow the whistle on them and who leak. But there's also a moral choice made by those who work inside the system and don't dissent, who obey the rules, who allow it to be perpetuated. These are both moral choices. And the way that the discussion gets obscured is that the people who are the guardians of the status quo never want to look at what motivates obedience to these rules, a failure to dissent from the system. That, too, is a moral choice. And if the system is inherently illegitimate, if it's doing incredibly unjust things, the truly immoral choice, perhaps even the psychologically questionable choice, is not dissenting from the system or blowing the whistle on it or disclosing huge amounts of information about it. It's failing to do that. It's continuing to work within it, to perpetuate its injustices. And so it's only by depicting critics and dissidents as somehow flawed, radically personalities and even psyche can the justifiability and viability of the system be defended. And I think that's really what's at the root of the way whistleblowers are so consistently demonized and attacked.
Robert, I want to get you to comment on that, because whistleblowing is increasingly an important political tool, isn't it, surely? And where do we go from here in terms of the significance of whistleblowing?
If I can just add a little bit to what Glenn said and then take up that question. I go back to my politics really began thinking about the Soviet Union. And what they did, at a certain point, Stalin just shot anyone, even people that didn't dissent. But later on, by the time you got to Brezhnev and so on, Khrushchev, they put them in mental asylums. It was one of the forming moments for my political development, is that dissidents were seen technically to be mentally ill. And so, in a way, what's happening in a different way, and perhaps not quite as an extreme a way, is this targeting the people who've shown moral courage and put their lives at risk in the way that Glenn so eloquently put it. If I can also say, I can't stop myself, about the question of, going through legitimate channels. Imagine Edward Snowden going to he'd have to leave his company and go to the head of the NSA and say, I'm worried about the stuff you're doing. I mean, I work at a university, and, in a university, people don't get anywhere by saying things to vice-chancellors. So the idea, and, I also have to say about that the most astonishing situation has arisen in regard to whistleblowing with Edward Snowden at the moment. And the information I get is mainly from The Guardian now, which I read every day, and Glenn, but other journalists as well. At the moment, the head of intelligence in America is saying we have to have a debate about what we've been doing. We know that what we've been doing is very questionable and even at the edge of legality or unlawful. It's not a dissident saying it, it's the head of the intelligence services. What Edward Snowden has done is raised the biggest issue about privacy that you could raise. The idea that he could have done that by, going privately is sort of ludicrous. But the other paradox that we've come to is the person that has provoked a debate that the intelligence chiefs are saying needed to be had, and the secret court is saying we're worried about what's happened, and members of Congress are saying what the fuck was going on. We didn't even know this was happening, if I can put it in an academic language. But they're saying that. At the same time, they're saying that Edward Snowden is a traitor. I mean, what he's done, even from the simple view of reading a newspaper, is to have forced the real elite, the defence and political elite of the United States, to face up to the astonishing nature of what the head of the NSA was doing. And then he's regarded as somehow not as a moral hero, but as someone who deserves the rest of his life in prison. It's an incredible paradox. So when you say, what can whistleblowing do? I would maybe 5 years ago have wondered what it might do. And one of the phrases that I picked up from Julian that I know is central to him, which is courage is contagious. Well, for most of us it's not, but for a very tiny proportion of human beings it is. And so what whistleblowing can do, and that's what I think all of this stuff is about, is for those very few individuals who have that kind of courage and are willing to, as it were, sacrifice their lives, is to point to some of the real ills of our age. So I can only think now that the very few people will be inspired by WikiLeaks, but also inspired by Chelsea Manning and inspired by Edward Snowden, and they may be sitting who knows where and when, but thinking maybe, these issues are larger than my comfort. So where it will go, no one knows, but I think from this point of view, this is almost the central political issue of our times, as to how the few individuals who I think of like the great Soviet dissidents that I once heroized may make a difference at a time when a difference must be made.
Glenn, we've spoken obviously a lot, and we'll continue to talk a lot about Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning, but there have been a number of other national security whistleblowers in recent years that have drawn the legal wrath of the US government. Can you just take us quickly through how the Obama administration has pursued other whistleblowers and done so more ruthlessly than any previous administration, indeed more ruthlessly than any previous or all previous administrations combined. Of course, Barack Obama came to the presidency promising to protect whistleblowers, but seems to have fallen a little bit short in terms of that promise.
Yeah, just a little bit. I think that it's a pretty well-known fact now that President Obama, the gap between the image and the brand that was created for him and the reality of who he is universes wide. I don't think that's really news. And I think people know as well by now, specifically the statistic that you referenced, which is that more whistleblowers have been prosecuted under the Espionage Act of 1917 during President Obama's term than all prior presidents combined. In fact, double the number have been prosecuted under espionage statutes during his presidency, and that includes presidents previously perceived as being extremely hostile to press freedoms like Richard Nixon and George W. Bush. He has surpassed all of them in an extraordinary way. But I think that the more important point than just that fact is that it is an extremely selective punishment of leakers and whistleblowers. So if it were the case that every person in Washington who was leaking classified information without authority was being harshly punished in an unprecedented way, you could at least have a reasonable debate about whether or not classified information and the sanctity of it is such that it ought to be protected using the force of the law and that the rule of law compels harsh prosecutions, as long as every leaker was being treated with more or less equal harshness. The opposite is true, though. Washington has always and continues to run on leaks of classified information. Every single day, top-level Obama officials leak classified information to virtually every establishment reporter in Washington. The goal of those leaks, though, are to glorify the President of the United States or to propagandize the public to believe the policies and actions of the United States government are justified and warranted. These kind of leaks, the one that serve the establishment interest and promote the agenda of political leaders, are never punished. They're never prosecuted. They're the things that happen every day between the most powerful people. In fact, between the very people who demand that other kinds of leaks, namely ones that bring transparency to those in power, that undermine that system, be harshly punished. So it isn't that President Obama believes in the sanctity of classified information or the rule of law and is therefore harshly punishing those who leak classified information. He's only harshly punishing those who leak classified information when those leaks are contrary to his political interest and his policy agenda. When those leaks serve his political interest, such as when Pentagon officials met with the filmmakers who were going to make Zero Dark 30, the film about the killing of Osama bin Laden, and they had planned to release it in October, right before his reelection, the most politically potent weapon in his arsenal when he was running for reelection. When they met with those filmmakers and leaked all sorts of non-public information that they were in court telling courts they couldn't safely disclose in response to legal requests, none of those officials who passed on classified information to enable this hagiography film to be made has been investigated, let alone prosecuted. Same with all of the leakers who ran to the New York Times to glorify how careful and yet resolved and resolute Obama is when he targets people for assassination. What this is really about is deterring people from leaking in a way that brings real transparency and challenges the U.S. government. It's a way of deterring people who might blow the whistle on wrongdoing by saying, look at what it is that we've done to Chelsea Manning. Look at what it is that we're trying to do to Edward Snowden. You should think twice and more than twice if you want to challenge the U.S. government. But if you want to leak to serve the U.S. government, that's not only permissible, but encouraged and very common in the halls of official Washington.
Julian, I just want to remind people as well that even if Bob Carr refuses to accept it, there's an ongoing investigation into both WikiLeaks and yourself by the US Department of Justice, and there's a financial blockade that continues to be in place in relation to WikiLeaks. Can you just give us a bit of a status update on the financial blockade and what you understand is the situation vis-a-vis the investigation into WikiLeaks and yourself from the United States?
In relation to the investigation, it is ongoing. It was front page of the New York Times back in June. I understand Alexa O'Brien has additional, very recent, as of August 23rd or something, this month, confirmation from the DOJ, the Department of Justice in the United States, that is ongoing. Let's go back and understand where this all originated from. Pentagon spokesperson Jeff Morrell, in a 40-minute live to-camera press conference, made the following demands of WikiLeaks back in 2010 after the release of Afghan war logs. Number one, that we destroy all publications that we had made derived from documents coming from the Pentagon. Number two, that we destroy all our upcoming publications. And number three, that we stop dealing with US military whistleblowers, or soliciting, as the Pentagon called it, as if it was some kind of act of journalistic prostitution. Or else, as the Pentagon said to the world, we would be compelled, quote, compelled to do so. And when asked by journalists in the audience what mechanism would that compulsion take, the Pentagon stated to the world, well, this is the Department of Defense. We're not concerned with the law. Perhaps that's a matter for the DOJ. So there we see a situation where the Pentagon targeted an organization before the world and said, do it or we will compel you to do it. And they lost. We did not destroy a single publication that we had published. We did not censor any of our upcoming publications, and we did not cease dealing with US military whistleblowers. Those threats were repeated on September 28th last year to ABC News in the United States. And it is the view that every single time that someone reads a classified publication from the US government on WikiLeaks, that republication is occurring. So it's an ongoing matter. It's part of a clear decision that has taken place under the Obama administration to engage in a new kind of deterrent against information coming out about the national security establishment. Just imagine, let's look what happened with Syria, where Barack Obama said that there was a red line that Syria may not cross. Well, of course, it's a bit unclear exactly who crossed that red line in what circumstances. But does the Pentagon's threats, does the US government's threats have any credibility at all after they made such a threat against WikiLeaks and completely lost? Well, not really. And so now we have a situation where the US government is trying to regain its credibility. It made a threat, it lost. So now it has to try and do something else. And as David Coombs said before, going back to that 2008 report by the US Army Counterintelligence, a report that spoke about the need to target and destroy some of our whistleblowers in order to, quote, destroy the centre of gravity of WikiLeaks, the protection of its sources. Well, in that report, David Coombs mentioned the word whistleblowers, but that wasn't David Coombs' words. That's the words in the report. It didn't speak about leakers or potential espionage people recruited by WikiLeaks. No, it spoke about whistleblowers, the desire to stop whistleblowers, set a deterrent by going after our alleged sources.
I want to shift the discussion slightly now to, I guess, from the war on whistleblowing to the war on journalism itself. I want to start with you, Alexa. You were one of the very few journalists who covered the trial of Chelsea Manning. And yet this was a trial in which, by the ready admission of prosecutors, the charge of aiding the enemy would have applied even if it had been the New York Times rather than WikiLeaks that had published the material. Why was there so little US media interest in what should have been core business for the great watchdog institution of the American press?
Because they're lazy and incompetent, and they don't care. And that's how I've developed, through my experience of covering this trial, I've developed a disdain for a lot of journalists. Certainly there are great journalists within those institutions, but I'm not going to make excuses for the American press. They didn't show up consistently to the largest leak trial in US history, a trial that encompasses the largest criminal investigation ever into a publisher and its source. When you have the Wall Street Journal, writers at the Wall Street Journal publishing op-eds confusing aiding the enemy and espionage, how can you expect the American public to know what's going on in the courtroom? It was really, really disappointing, but also motivating because I think the journalists that did cover it consistently knew how important this trial was. And I think that I think the best word is radicalized by the truth of the experience of covering it, that we worked harder and decided that we were going to do everything in our power to make sure that the information got out.
David, from the perspective of being inside the trial, did the dearth of coverage, or conversely, the high quality of the few individuals who were covering it, how significant was that? Was that significant to you and Chelsea, or, I mean, were you too focused on the legal issues to have that sort of broader perspective?
Well, I think the lack of coverage certainly affected the case, partly because the media just simply missed an opportunity to cover a very important case. But I think for us, it would have had impact if this were something that was on the front page every day, something like the Jodi Arias trial or the George Zimmerman trial. Then a lot of the stuff the government did during the court-martial would have been subject to public scrutiny. And I think the government would have quickly changed its course. But problematic in our system was the fact that you could not have cameras in the courtroom, you could not have recording devices. And so you're not going to attract the mainstream media when they can't have a camera in the courtroom. So I think that was probably the primary reason the mainstream media didn't cover the case as much. But second to that, something that Alexa talked about, being a little bit lazy, it takes hard work to cover this case if you're a journalist. There are a lot of military terminology that's not generally known to most journalists. So you really have to work hard to just understand what's happening in the courtroom. And here, the mainstream media really lost, I think, sight of what this case stands for. And in my opinion, this case is going to be really kind of a watershed moment in freedom of the press, because you have a prosecution that has on more than one occasion said it would not make a difference who this leak was made to. If this leak was made to the New York Times, we'd still charge aiding the enemy. So you have an offense where a person has done nothing other than give information to a journalist, and that could be charged as aiding the enemy. No other intent required. And really what the government is doing here, I think, is setting up a argument that is not that far removed from now going after the journalist to try to say that if a journalist takes information from a whistleblower that's classified and publishes that, that journalist can be charged with aiding the enemy. And I think that's really why in our case, I'd almost felt at many times I had Julian Assange at the table, because the government had said so many times, WikiLeaks, had so many times referenced WikiLeaks, that it felt that WikiLeaks was a co-accused. And what they tried to do, and I think ineffectively, was delegitimize WikiLeaks to suggest that it's not a legitimate news organization. And Professor Yochai Benkler from Harvard, I think, did a fantastic job of really debunking that type of belief that WikiLeaks was not a legitimate news organization. And I think really what the government was trying to do in this case was say that it didn't make a difference if you leaked to New York Times. But on the off chance that we're not able to sell that, let's delegitimize WikiLeaks and say it's not a news organization. And let's try to argue that in some way it was a conspiracy, that Julian Assange did something to get information from Chelsea. Well, you know, the simple truth of the matter is WikiLeaks is a news organization. Julian Assange did not do anything to get information from Chelsea Manning. Chelsea gave information to a journalist in the hopes that it would be published, and it was. So I think, unfortunately, because of the dearth of coverage, daily coverage on this case, the news media really lost sight of the importance. And I think probably in a matter of a few years from now, maybe that'll dawn on mainstream media that what they really lost sight of was that this was a freedom of the press case. And this was a case about accountability, about the watchdog role that the media should play. And unfortunately, they were asleep at the switch.
Glenn, US politicians have called for you to be prosecuted over the Snowden revelations, and even some American journalists have endorsed that view, or appeared to endorse it, and then rode back under pressure. And I note that this isn't the first time that you've been targeted either. A couple of years ago, you, along with WikiLeaks, were mentioned as targets of a campaign of disruption by a group of US IT firms, one of whom, Palantir Technologies, by the way, is active here in Australia. What is going on with investigative journalism in the United States that the journalist who brings to the public's attention such amazing and important revelations as, for example, Edward Snowden has provided, is the target of, is the subject of demands that he be prosecuted? Glenn.
I think it gets back to the question that you just asked Alexa and David about the role that the U.S. media is and is not playing. And I think, hovering over the entire discussion that we've had is that question, because it's certainly true that incompetence and laziness and all of that motivate what the U.S. media often does. But I think there's a deeper pathology, which is that it really has changed how it views what its function and what its role is. So not only does it no longer see itself as being this adversarial force against the government, it actually starts to view anybody who does fulfill that function as being something other than journalists. There have been lots of amazing incidents. Just a couple months ago, the New York Times talked about Alexa, whose reporting it had used in all sorts of ways when reporting on the Bradley Manning case, and refused to refer to her as a journalist. It ultimately ran a correction, but they called her, I think, an activist. Since the reporting that I've been doing on the NSA story, the New York Times has twisted itself into all sorts of contortions to avoid applying that label to me. They first called me an anti-surveillance activist, and they've moved to blogger, and now they've settled on the lawyer, Glenn Greenwald, even though I haven't practiced law for 8 years. And I think that, one of the most amazing things was when it was revealed that WikiLeaks was the subject of a criminal grand jury investigation, the threat that posed so obviously to basic press freedoms should have meant that every single journalistic outlet, every single editor, every single television show should have been indignant in protest that the act of journalism, which WikiLeaks was engaged in, receiving information from a source and then informing the world through publication, the idea that that would be criminalized should have had them all outraged. And yet not only didn't it have them outraged, they were often leading the way in demanding that Julian's head be put on a pike because he was engaged in actual adversarial journalism, publishing that which the world's most powerful factions didn't want the world to know. And that's precisely, ironically, what they no longer see as journalism. They will read you out of journalism if you do exactly that which journalism is supposed to be about. And so there was a little time period when we first began when I actually thought that the possibility that I could be prosecuted, or Laura could be prosecuted, or people at The Guardian could be prosecuted for the journalism we were doing was really far-fetched, because I thought that just the media class would never allow that. That it would be such a huge scandal, that they would be so outraged by it, that it would constrain the government in being able to do that. And yet, as I saw those of us reporting on this being read out of journalism, not by the government, but by journalists, and as I saw the idea that we could be criminalized being normalized, not by the government, but by journalists like David Gregory and others, I actually started losing faith in the idea that there would be this huge media backlash against the criminalization of our journalism, and began realizing that it would be actually viable, that it could happen, just like they allowed it to happen to WikiLeaks, even though the former general counsel of the New York Times, James Goodall, has said that prosecuting WikiLeaks would be the most severe threat to press freedoms in American history. You barely heard any of them speaking out in protest. And I think that really gets to the core of the problem, that everything that we've been talking about over the last decade that has been allowed to happen in the West that's morally grotesque and irresponsible gets down to the fact that our journalistic outlets, our establishment journalistic outlets, no longer see themselves as adversarial to the government. They see themselves as servants to it. But worse than that is that they view being truly adversarial to the government as being something illegitimate, something that's the antithesis of journalism, and increasingly something that can even be legitimately criminalized. And that's the most amazing part, is not only will journalists acquiesce to the criminalization of journalism, they'll lead the way in advocating that it happens.
Back from the Department of Justice right now to see whether or not they're investigating Mr. Greenwald, Ms. Poitras, Sarah Harrison, related to the Snowden leaks. I had actually inquired, I've been obviously taking close notice of what's going on in the Eastern District of Virginia. I've been down to the clerk's office many times, and I had asked them, well, are you investigating those 3 individuals? And they said, please speak to the Department of Justice. So.
And we should probably note at this point that, Julian, right now the US Congress is considering a shield law bill that virtually explicitly excludes WikiLeaks. This seems to be sort of part 220 of the WikiLeaks is not a real journalism outfit sort of saga, doesn't it?
Well, look, I've seen those bills before. I can't tell you how wonderful it is to wake up one morning and read how there's a bill before the US Congress, then proposed by Peter T. King, Congressman Peter T. King and Senator Lieberman, to declare all your staff enemy combatants that can be assassinated at will by a US drone program or otherwise renditioned. That was back in early 2011, or late 2010. Now, this week, there's a proposed shield law going up before Congress with a so-called Assange amendment to exclude WikiLeaks from those protections. And how does it do that? Very interesting. It says that a media organization or otherwise media organization, which, given the totality of its work, has as its majority purpose the revelation of, quote, primary source material to the public, is not eligible for any kind of shield law. Now, I would say, actually, in fact, that's really the only serious kind of journalism that exists, as journalism that is backed up by proof, whether that's by a war photographer or war videographer getting that primary source material, or whether that's the sort of work that you've seen Glenn involved in over the last few months, proving what you say. Otherwise, it's just a matter of opinion.
I want to say something to... Having been in the press pool at this military trial, you know, of course, I've come across many different journalists. They come in and they come out. Some are more regular, some are less. And it was interesting to actually talk to these journalists, unnamed journalists, one-on-one about Greenwald, about Assange. And I would have to say that the majority of them, I mean, I actually had a mainstream journalists tell me things like, well, we can't cover Guantanamo because our stories about puppets get better ratings. Or have, and this was actually a really nice person, you know, who wants to cover Guantanamo. Or having, you know, a very established major newspaper journalist tell me that, you know, well, if Glenn just would stop being so snarky, he wouldn't have as many problems as he's having. I mean, these are like educated, professional journalists. So it was really an education for me in how ridiculously, I'm not being provocative for the sake of being provocative, how really actually incompetent many of these individuals are about thinking about the important things that are going on in the world. And that they should probably get a different job than being a journalist. Yeah. I just wanted to add that.
Very, very succinctly.
Can I add one sentence? Glenn said before that journalists are the servants of government. Well, in Australia, it's more, with 70% the Murdoch press, they're the masters of government.
Yes, remember, Robert, Rupert doesn't approve of that 70% figure. He thinks it's 50% or 60%. It's not 70%. Okay, look, time is nearly upon us, and I've been assured that the lights are simply going to be turned off at 9:30. So I want to ask each of our participants tonight a final question to answer in their own way, or perhaps answer not at all if they don't wish to. But we've been talking about the war on whistleblowers, the war on journalism. What's at stake here if we lose this war? I mean, it's not a finite war on terror style. It will probably go on permanently, but what are the stakes here in terms of if the forces of transparency and scrutiny lose or continue to lose, what are we going to lose as a society? David Coombs.
Yeah, I think I'll answer this as a soldier, actually. Even though I have 12 years of active duty, I'm still in the reserves as a lieutenant colonel. And I will tell you that soldiers don't decide policy. We are, you know, given our orders and we carry those out. And whenever you have American military, or for that matter, any military, going into a country to carry out a certain mission, it's because they've been ordered to do so. And again, we don't question the orders, we just simply follow through on the mission. The problem becomes when you're asking militaries to build countries, to be diplomats. The military is a blunt force object that breaks things. That's what we're good at. We don't build things, and it puts us in a very difficult position when we do. And usually things such as Iraq, Afghanistan, or what we're debating now, Syria, when the military becomes involved, it's because of failed diplomacy. It's because the people who make the decisions cannot resolve the issue. And that diplomacy, sometimes that happens and it's a failure, and you have to have the military come in and achieve a certain outcome. And that's acceptable and understandable, and I would fully support that. But what is problematic is when that diplomacy is done in secret, or when you have decisions being made on less than full and accurate information. Then when you put the military in that position, not only is that unfair to the military, but oftentimes it results in conduct that later generations will undoubtedly look back upon and say is problematic. And so what is critically important is that we have a media that is fulfilling its role of the watchdog, of ensuring that the public is fully aware of what is being debated and what is happening in order to make informed decisions of when you want to use the military. And in order to do that, I want to just go full circle to what I said at the very beginning. When Chelsea saw what she saw in the significant activity reports, the SIGACs, she said later that this is one of the more important documents of our time. And the reason why she felt that was it showed daily what the military was being asked to do and the loss of human life on a daily basis. And the collateral murder video really kind of shows the consequences of that, because as a soldier, you have to almost separate yourself from the fact that you are killing people in order to go to sleep at night. And that dehumanizing individuals is tragic. And it should only be done, obviously, as a very last recourse, if at all. And what's important is that we have a media that ensures that when we do dedicate military forces, that it's done because there are no other resources, no other outcomes. People like Glenn Greenwald, like Alex O'Brien, hardworking journalists, and people like Julian Assange and the organization WikiLeaks are vital in order to ensure that we do, in fact, make informed decisions when we decide we're going to put our sons and daughters, mothers and fathers, in harm's way, because that's the last recourse.
Thanks, David. Glenn, what do we stand to lose if we lose this war, if we lose this conflict?
Yeah, I would say two things. One is just picking on up on what David just said. There is this massive apparatus that the U.S. government runs and controls in concert with the largest media outlets to disseminate and bombard us all with the information that they want us to know, which is the information that makes them look good, that bolsters their power, that lets us believe that what they're doing is just. And one of the key questions that we have is, are we going to simply be subjected in this unilateral barrage to the information that they want us to know, which is the definition of propaganda that those empowered disseminate and tell us that we ought to believe? Or will there be some countervailing force to expose the information that undermines those claims, that proves when they're false, that gives us an ability to have a balanced assessment so that we can critically scrutinize rather than just uncritically ingest the message that is coming from those in power? I think that's really what's at stake, is whether we're going to be informed citizens or subject to this unchallengeable propaganda scheme. And the effort to punish whistleblowers, to deter whistleblowers, to build this massive secrecy scheme that has no outlet for it, is really about making sure that the message of propaganda goes unchallenged, that it's unchallengeable, that it's the only thing that people around the world are hearing. The other thing that I would say is at stake more broadly is what the internet will be. It has always been the promise of the internet from its advent that it would be this incredible, unprecedentedly powerful tool of liberalization, democratization, liberation, that it would enable people who didn't have much power to band together to effectively challenge those who were in power in ways that had previously been unthinkable. And that's still very possible for the internet to be a tool of that kind of democratization and liberation. We've seen that happen in all sorts of ways. But it's also possible that the exact opposite will happen, that the internet could become the worst and most potent tool of control and oppression, which is what will happen if we allow virtually all forms of human interaction and thought and behavior and communication to be transported onto it, while at the same time we allow the US government and its allies to monitor and store and control everything that is taking place so that there's no realm of privacy within it. And that to me is probably the overarching and paramount question, is we are at this crossroads where we are going to decide whether the internet will be this tool of liberation or this unprecedented tool of oppression and control. And I think if we lose this war that we're waging, that's being waged on whistleblowers and journalism and internet freedom and privacy and transparency, the outcome will be the one that I think all decent people desperately want to avoid.
Robert, what do we stand to lose?
Well, it's interesting. The discussion so far has mainly been about whistleblowing and war. I just want to, because it's my nature, I want to be slightly dissident and say that I'm not in favour of total transparency as an idea, and I think Julian and I might disagree about this. To give the most obvious example, if the details of D-Day had fallen into the hands of someone in the British or American military, I think it would have been utterly irresponsible to let the Nazis know that the Americans and British were about to invade Europe. So I think the issue is not about total transparency, but it's about when individuals in positions where they're seeing what's going on understand in conscience that things that are wrong are happening. In other words, we rely in this area, as in so much of life, on our morality and our sense of truthfulness and justice. So if that's the case, if I can say this, that I think the overwhelming issue of our age, despite how serious questions of war are, which I wouldn't for a minute deny, the overwhelming question for our age is the fact that this generation is allowing the planet slowly to be destroyed and doing absolutely nothing about it. And it seems to me there that I'm hoping that the prick of conscience will happen in fossil fuel corporations, in their employees. And the philosopher Zizek wrote a very good article recently, always in The Guardian, saying the heroes of the time are Snowden and Manning and Julian Assange. He said, often what they've told us are things we already know, but they've given us the detail, which makes a very big difference. We don't just kind of know it, we really know it because of the primary evidence that Julian publishes. And I'm hoping that the primary evidence about the thinking of the executives in the fossil fuel corporations, their pretense that you can capture carbon and store it, their tactics about feeding denialist think tanks, and so on and so forth. I'm hoping there'll be someone like a Manning or like a Snowden in one of these huge fossil fuel corporations that will tell us what we already know, that not in the question of war, but in the question of the destruction of the planet, what's going on. So that's a way of saying we've got a heck of a lot to lose if people are frightened, which I take it the war on whistleblowers in the end is a tactic of intimidation. And I can only hope that for the sake of humankind, it doesn't work.
And Julian, a last word from you. It's the same question. I mean, what do we stand to lose here?
Well, I think Glenn and David have stolen most of my talking points and put it rather well. Okay, so every law, every constitution, every regulation, every government protest, in fact, society itself, civilization itself, going back thousands of years, comes about as a result of people communicating with each other about what is the true nature of our institutions and the environment under which we live. So if you ask what is at stake, well, civilization itself is at stake. Glenn is quite correct to say that we are at a crossroads. On the one hand, one direction lies a really significant lurch towards dystopia. I'm serious about that. That this way, with the stitching together of a new transnational security apparatus spying on all of us. Everyone in this room has already been spied on in relation to their visa transactions, any interaction that they've had with Google, or in fact any site that crosses US borders. They've been spied on by a national security agency. That direction is the militarization of cyberspace, interestingly just referred to a few days ago by former NSA Director Michael Hayden. The militarization of cyberspace is not just the militarization of cyberspace, because society and the internet have merged together. The internet is now the nervous system of our communication, domestically, internationally, between organizations, economic transfers, our political beliefs, activist groups, all stitched together by the internet. And if sitting in between those communications is a military organization, intelligence organization, and its vast, sprawling mass of contractors, not just in the United States, a transnational grouping involving, say, BAE from the UK, which is also in Sweden, in Australia, Northrop Grumman, a sprawling mass. That is an undemocratic institution, a network which is slowly but surely lifting off the rest of the society which it finds itself enmeshed in. So we have a militarization of cyberspace, which equals a militarization of a civilian space, but it is now the number one civilian space of human and society interaction, which equals a militarization of global Western civilization. That is a serious problem. The coming together of those different parts, well, they're being stitched together as a result of very fast information interaction and fast economic interaction. For example, the US State Department budget has now moved in under the national security budget. Hardly reported, once an independent point of US power. USAID has been moved in under the national security budget, once an independent point of US power. The New York Times, as Glenn spoke about, and some of the other major US media corporations have similarly been, see themselves as allied to that system. So there is a clumping together of a very significant transnational power apparatus that involves all of us, because the internet involves all of us. That's in this direction. In this other direction lies what is going on right now in this conversation that we're having, which is the development of a new open international body politic which has certain standards and values and beliefs that it fights for. It is clear what the first belief is that is falling out of that. It is the right for all of us to at least communicate with each other about what is happening to the world and the society that we live in. But if you ask this war on whistleblowers, who's going to win it, who's going to lose it, well, there has been two very important standoffs. The two big battles that were publicly announced. That was by the Pentagon back in 2010, made a public declaration against us, and it lost. There was another manhunt for Edward Snowden and to stifle those publications. It has also similarly lost. So through courageous work by a growing network of individuals like like Glenn and Laura Poitras and the various whistleblowers around, and our journalist Sarah Harrison, who is now in exile in Russia. We are really making some headway against this. And the sound that you're hearing, the concern that you're hearing in this debate, it comes about as a result of the clash between these different groups. That is the struggle that is echoing right now around the world. We see it in the detention of Glenn Greenwald's partner, David Miranda, flying through London, and the commencement of an anti-terrorism case there, in the raid on the Guardian newspaper's headquarters by British intelligence GCHQ. But we also see it in the fight back against that, in the publications, in the criminal defence work done by David Coombs, in the secondary work done by fine journalists like Alexa O'Brien.
Alexa, you get the last word, so over to you.
Well, I think all these gentlemen have sort of covered all the bases with regards to the ideological battle, the political battle. I mean, fundamentally, I'm going to bring it back down to the personal for me. What happens if I don't do what needs to be done to make sure that the public is informed about the most important things that are going on? What happens inside of myself? I mean, you know, when I think about what sort of drove me to cover the Manning trial, I don't pretend to understand it completely, but it was fundamentally the idea that I couldn't live with myself if I didn't do it. And I think also it was fundamentally also a challenge to myself of whether or not I had free will, whether or not I really believed in liberal democracy, that an informed public can govern themselves. Or am I just simply a slave to whatever's going on around me? Do I have the power to make a choice, an informed decision? And if I truly believe in those ideals, then what am I doing about it? And do I have the courage to do the work and those kinds of things? So I think it always comes back to that, even when we talk about these grand things, because the line of complicity runs through each of us. And I think that the Manning's leaks and WikiLeaks publications and Snowden's leaks and Glenn Greenwald's work, they inspire us because I think they inspire us to be better than we think we are, or to actually believe in wisdom, strength, and beauty, and knowledge.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we've gone way over time, but I think you'll agree it's been worth it. It's been a fantastic discussion. I want to thank our three international guests who've participated courtesy of telecommunications, no doubt with the watchful eye of the NSA on it. David Coombs, Glenn Greenwald, Julian Assange, thank you all very much. And of course, thank you to our two wonderful guests here on the stage, Robert Mann and Alexa O'Brien. Thank you. That's all from us from the Sydney Opera House. I hope it stopped raining out there, and good night.